Welcome everyone to this live stream and in-person event on humanitarian intervention and mass atrocities with distinguished guests who've joined us here today. But before we get going, I'd like to hand over to the Dean of the Colin Powell School for Civic and International Leadership, Professor Andy Rich.
Well, thank you. I'll just take a minute, but I want to welcome everybody to this important conversation about humanitarian interventions and mass atrocity crime. And I'm just going to provide a very brief context for this event, which is that some years ago, Dirk Moses's predecessor as the Spitzer Chair in International Relations was part of a group of faculty from across divisions at City College that created the Human Rights Forum. A conversation, a place for conversation, discussion, debate about the future of human rights and human rights interventions around the world and the ways that they mattered here on our campus. And that is Rajan Menon, who is the prior holder of the Spitzer Chair in International Relations. And so one of the things that's exciting about today's event is that you have two Spitzer chairs in your presence at one time, sitting on opposite ends. But the other is that this conversation is part of a long thread of conversations that City College has felt was really important to this community, both because it matters to the world, but also because I think it matters to our students. So many of our students, and we've seen this over successive generations of students who come to City College, come from places where there have been humanitarian abuses, where there have been mass atrocities. And in fact, if you kind of measure the change in who goes to City College over a period of decades, you can often do it in connection with where there have been wars and atrocities around the world. So it matters both to how we understand international relations, but also how we understand these things in a very personal way on this campus. So I want to thank Professor Moses and all of our guests for being with us today and for putting this together. I also want to acknowledge Danielle Zach, who is the manager of and coordinator of, and I guess director of the Human Rights Forum, and the person who gets water when no one else thought to do it. So Danielle, thank you for everything you do to put this together. And I'm looking forward to a good conversation. So thank you very much, Dirk.
Thanks very much, Professor Rich. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel today. To my immediate left, we have Savita Ponde, who's Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, which was established in 2008 with the support of international human rights leaders. And the Global Center is the world's leading research and advocacy organization for advancing the international norm of the responsibility to protect, known as R2P, at the UN and beyond. She's a foremost expert on R2P and atrocity prevention. Over the last decade, she's worked extensively with and advised a wide range of governments in the UN on how to prevent and respond to mass atrocities. And she's routinely convened foreign ministers and other high-level policymakers on R2P to mobilize action and to protect populations from atrocity crimes. She also led the Global Center's work on UN peacekeeping, international justice, and other mechanisms relating to women, peace and security, and advocacy on specific country situations where populations are at risk, such as Syria, Myanmar, South Sudan, Yemen, and Ethiopia. Before joining the Global Center, she worked in various capacities as a researcher and project manager in India, several African countries, and here in New York. Then in the middle, we have Professor Jennifer Welch, who's the Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security at McGill University in Montreal. She was previously Professor and Chair of International Relations at the European University Institute in Florence, where we taught together for a few years and even a class, as well as before that at the University of Oxford, where she co-founded the Oxford Institute on Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. And significantly, in relation to this topic, between 2013 and 16, she served as a special advisor to the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, on R2P. So a theorist or a scholar and a practitioner. She's the author and co-author and editor of many books and articles on this topic, most recently, The Return to History, Conflict, Migration and Geopolitics in the 21st Century, and another book, The Responsibility to Protect, Overcoming the Challenges of Atrocity Prevention, 2015. Finally, on my far left, we have Rajan Menon, my predecessor in this job, who's a director now of the Defense Strategy Program at Defense Priorities, which is an NGO or a think tank in DC. But contrary to its name, it's not a warmongering think tank. It's the opposite. It's quite the opposite. And was the Anne and Bernard Spitzer Chair here at City College. He's also a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His books include Soviet Power in the Third World, The End of Alliances, Conflict in Ukraine from 2015, and relevant to this topic, The Conceit of Humanitarian Intervention from Oxford University Press in 2016. So as you can see, no one is more qualified than our three panelists to talk about these topics. Now, I sent them in advance a list of questions that would get the conversation going. And as we go through the questions, I'll ask them in different orders or different sequences. So everyone gets to start and set the agenda or to have the last word. Okay. But I think we'll begin with you, Savita. And the question is, what is the status of R2P today, especially since Libya in 2011? Would love to hear your thoughts.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be back at City College. I was at the Graduate Center, know Danielle very well, and it's always nice to be around CUNY campuses. And it's such a pleasure to share a panel with Jennifer Welsh, who's a board member of the Global Center and was the former special advisor and very much shaped the thinking around R2P for many years. So, I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think that, there's such a, within academic circles, I think that there's such a sort of considering Libya in 2011 as such a watershed moment. I think that even policy circle, that moment exists, but it's sort of, we have moved on from there. But I would sort of say, answer that question in sort of with two tracks. So one track is sort of, where normatively R2P is in terms of its traction within the international community. And in that context, I would say that since 2011, I mean, we talk a lot about Libya and R2P, but, during exactly the same time, Resolution 1975 was adopted, which was on Côte d'Ivoire, and it used the terminology on the responsibility to protect. And Côte d'Ivoire is, quote unquote, considered a success. So we don't talk that much about it. And with Libya also, I would just sort of, put this in front of you that I think that in the context of R2P, it was successful. Within 2 days, we had a no-fly zone. We had arms embargo. So the international community did come together. We had India, South Africa, and Brazil in the UN Security Council. They didn't, vote no on any of the resolutions. They actually abstained. And if you see the statements made by the ambassadors, they were very much acknowledging that we cannot be indifferent in the situation because the signs were there. Like I was around in 2011, we were all crowding around a computer watching the vote, how it was sort of unfolding. So at that time, I mean, they were, sort of marking doors in Benghazi and people, I mean, the threat was very, very real of atrocity crimes. So Libya in that context was successful. What was not successful about Libya was how then the resolutions and the sort of the violations of the arms embargo and all of those different contexts which came into being. So that's the reason sort of, R2P and Libya is always in the same breath. But in terms of sort of after that, we've had over 80 resolutions in the UN Security Council, multiple resolutions, I mean, in hundreds in the Human Rights Council, in the General Assembly, we have had a few resolutions on R2P. So in terms of how the international community thinks about it, counting the mentioning of R2P within resolutions is a good indicator of how you measure where R2P is at. It's also one of the only protection norms which sits within the General Assembly. So unlike women, peace and security or protection of civilians, which sit in the environs of the UN Security Council, R2P actually has been, debated and voted on the most within the General Assembly. So the entire membership sort of votes on this this topic, and the votes have been yearly on whether to include it in the sort of like bureaucratic things about whether to include this in the agenda of the General Assembly. And in all those votes, what we have seen is that 2/3 of membership literally has voted for R2P. So if you measure the votes in the General Assembly, you will see that there is consensus or a huge majority of the membership sort of, goes for it. And in the sort of the normative part of it, the one thing that, the Secretary General's reports have also done is to sort of pivot the discussion from only thinking in terms of military action. Civil society organizations, the UN Office on Prevention of Genocide, the different special advisors have consistently talked about R2P as a preventive tool. So it's a large toolbox with many different tools in it. So again, pivoting the discussion from just reaction to prevention. And that has been a huge sort of way in which we have thought about it. We have developed better early warning indicators. Now we understand how atrocity prevention is distinct from conflict prevention or human rights promotion or democracy promotion. What are some of the things that atrocity prevention catches which other frameworks miss? In terms of sort of proliferation of just the centers, the books on atrocity prevention, R2P has sort of led to the creation of atrocity prevention as a technical field in which a lot of organizations sit at, work on. So that's sort of the normative side. On the international action side, I would say that, despite many, many failures, I mean, with Syria, what we have seen unfold is really tragic. But in the context of, let's say, Mali and the Central African Republic, now I'm in the weeds on the UN jargon, and so apologies for that. But again, I mean, a peacekeeping mission was created. The discourse around CAR in Mali was very much about protecting civilians from atrocity crimes. So there's a consciousness which has creeped in around atrocity crimes, about how we prevent them, how do we seek justice for them. In the same vein, because the UN Security Council has been so unsuccessful, so blocked, especially after the Syria and the sort of standoff between the US and Russia around this particular issue, or P3 in Russia, that we have seen the General Assembly Act. So now you have IIIM, which is the International Investigative Mechanism on Syria, which is about collecting evidence of atrocities committed in Syria. So it's about collecting and preserving evidence for future justice initiatives. Same thing with Myanmar. In the Human Rights Council, we have seen adoption of various commissions of inquiry, which again center atrocity prevention, center the language of how do we think about prevention of atrocities within their mandates, the way they investigate, the way they collect information. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to sort of say that there have been sort of these two streams of how we actually practice it, and sort of the proliferation of just thinking about how we talk about prevention of atrocities. And I just want to add that my final point is that I think that over the last decade or so, what we've also seen is, and I would really implore the academic world to sort of pivot the conversation from just focusing on military interventions. Because, since Somalia really, where humanitarian intervention, or sort of Kosovo, you would say, would be the last example, we don't really have intervention in the context of boots on the ground anymore. Any of the situations that are ongoing in the world, nowhere does the Global Center or anybody who's actually working on atrocity prevention actually calls for military action, because that is not what is needed. From Sudan to South Sudan, Myanmar, and I can give you multiple examples. What we need is governments to take responsibility. So I think that to pivot away from this discussion of military intervention also sort of focuses and teaches our students to think in terms of prevention, because atrocities don't happen in a day. There is an entire process which takes place. So if you think in terms of teaching these courses about what is state responsibility, what is international community responsibility in prevention, the discussions are more nuanced, rather than thinking just in terms of sort of, obsession with military. So I'll stop there.
This is very good to know. Thanks very much. And I will be coming back to many of those points, I think. So you opened it up for us. Jennifer, have you got anything? Make sure you speak in the mic, guys, too. So just pull it closer to you.
Yeah, it's a great question, in 2023 to answer where the principle of responsibility to protect is. And I guess I'd open by saying that as a political principle, and I'm going to come back to that, it sits nested within a number of other political principles, and in some cases legal principles, that are seeking to protect populations. And generally speaking, we're living in a moment in history where a number of those principles are under enormous strain. Even the most basic principles around the delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance, which isn't necessarily about protection in the sense that's understood by responsibility to protect. We're seeing violations of those norms on a shockingly regular basis. So we are in a difficult normative environment generally. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. If I go back, Dirk, to your question about Libya, I think one of the starting points for me in thinking about responsibility to protect is that given it focuses on atrocity crimes, we need to remember that these are relatively low frequency, yet very high impact events. And what I mean by that, any of you doing quantitative studies or anything like that, the N is small, right? We don't have a huge number of instances in which atrocity crimes are actually committed. We have, some of them have been incredibly important in their impact, but what that also means is that policymakers, but I think also academics, are very influenced by particular cases. And those cases shape what happens next. It's our memory of past cases that often influences the way that we approach our current or present moment. And so when I think about the Libya case in particular from 2011, I think it did two things. And Savita has alluded to that. Firstly, I think it put the behavior of Western states really under the microscope. So those of you who have studied that case will know that the timing was very rapid, right? So there was an emerging crisis in the city of Benghazi, and decisions had to be made very quickly. There was one Security Council resolution passed, and then another quite soon after. And I'll sort of overgeneralize for the purposes of this conversation. One of the things that happened was that mainly Western states who carried out the intervention, who implemented the Security Council's resolution, said in effect, you need to trust us to abide by international humanitarian law, to undertake this operation in the right way. And what we saw afterwards is that many states, because of what happened on the ground, said, I don't think we can trust you anymore to do things in a way that are so rapid that have no accountability. And I really think that has stuck because there were concerns about how the mandate was interpreted and what followed afterwards. So I think that was a kind of a permanent or semi-permanent effect. And as much as one, and I saw this in the UN when I, at the time, was working on the responsibility to protect. As much as one wanted to say, the next case that comes along is different. It has a different set of circumstances. The memory of Libya, just like the memory of Rwanda or the memory of Somalia, loomed very large. And so we know, just from looking at diplomatic records and looking at the discourse of states, that when it came time to try to deliberate over collective action in Syria, that some states' positions were affected by their perceptions about what happened in Libya. And that's just a reality that of being affected by cases in a very profound way. I do think Savita's also right in that it really also, and this is my second point on Libya, placed the use of military force in the service of trying to prevent or respond to atrocity crimes under much greater scrutiny as well. And particularly, and this is a theme that I really learned from our other panelist, Rajan, is the aftermath of using military force and the unintended consequences of using military force that you, as a policymaker, you're morally obligated, I believe, have to try to anticipate what impact the use of force will have. But there are some consequences that are difficult to foresee. And we know in Libya that they have been profound, the consequences of the use of force. So I think it did those two things. I'll just conclude this kind of opening round, Dirk, by saying that when we step back in 2023, I think we have to remember that responsibility to protect is a political principle. It's not a legal principle. It didn't create any new law. What it did was try to encourage states to comply with their existing legal obligations under the Genocide Convention, under the Geneva Convention, under international human rights instruments. And so as a political principle, what could it do? Or what could it be expected to do? And I'll throw out there three things for debate or engagement, right? So political principles, firstly, should catalyze action or can be used to catalyze action, to sort of mobilize people. Think of the idea of sustainable development or other political principles that we have. Secondly, and this is the harder one, political principles should raise the political costs of inaction, right? So if there is a principle calling for something and you don't see something, there should be political costs to you not acting. And then thirdly, I think political principles can help build institutional capacity, right? Policy capacity. And I think on that third element, responsibility to protect has been very successful in building policy and institutional capacity to try to learn more about the factors that give rise to atrocity crimes and to think about ways to address them. On the political costs of inaction, I'd maybe give it a B minus, C plus even, right? And in terms of mobilizing action, I think it's been an up and down story, right? So one of the things that concerns me is that, and this is a debate we often have amongst academics and those more in the practitioner community. But one of the things that concerns me is that we won't always see explicit attention to responsibility to protect or atrocity prevention in real crises. That certain actors won't use that framing. And I think that that is problematic if we're thinking about the life cycle of a principle. And that's something for us to keep in mind. But as Savita mentioned, there has been lots of discussion of responsibility to protect in a variety of crises since Libya. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. Rajan.
Thank you. It's good to be back. I spent 10 very happy years here at City. Can you all see me?
That's why I leaned forward.
I'm going to stand up only because
You could use a lectern then.
because of a biking episode, shall we say, I wrenched my back and sitting down is hard, but I can see all of you this way, which is good. In discussions like this on humanitarian intervention, I am, as it were, the proverbial skunk at the party. So I want to make some things clear. I don't like the fact that governments commit atrocities against people that they are supposed to protect. You'd have to be a psychopath to want that. Nor do I think that sovereignty gives you the right to do anything at any time to anyone within your borders. We call such regimes murderous regimes, and for a good reason. So the debate about humanitarian intervention should not be pitting the angels who believe in it and want to protect innocent people against the devils who are somehow against it, because then you cannot have an honest conversation. That's one thing. Now, your question was, excuse me, how has it fared in the aftermath of Libya, the responsibility to protect? Let me point out that the responsibility to protect is not a new idea. The idea that governments have certain responsibilities to people who live in their jurisdiction is certainly enunciated, was certainly enunciated in the Nuremberg trials. It is inherent in UNDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's in the Torture Convention. It's in the 1966 UN General Assembly Resolution on Civil and Political Rights, and so on, right? So it addresses the question that's much narrower. In situations that are not state-to-state wars, because those are covered by Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, when governments, through negligence or premeditation, are killing their people, what should the international community do? I also think the term international community is a misnomer. Who is the international community? What number do I use to call it, as Henry Kissinger said, of the United Nations? So on Libya, it may be true that the proponents of R2P have gone beyond it, but I can assure you the people of Libya have not. So let's review the record. This is a country that was ruled by a brutal dictator, but one who in his day was embraced by the likes of former Prime Minister Tony Blair, Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi. He funded a program at the LSE. He gave oil concessions to multinational corporations. During the war on terror, the United States rendered prisoners without trial to Gaddafi. So this idea that all of a sudden in 2011, good heavens, Gaddafi commits atrocities, we didn't know anything about this, we would never have dealt with him, is a pious fiction. It's simple hypocrisy. But let's look at Libya today. There are two governments. There are 45 armed militias that don't listen to either government. There's a renegade general that doesn't listen to either the militias or the two governments. There are drug traffickers, sex traffickers, and thousands of people in trying to escape this have drowned in the Mediterranean in a world in which when Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed with open arms in Europe, as well they should be, I have no problem with that, these people are not welcome. So I don't know that R2P has been killed by Libya, but it's certainly been dealt a body blow, and it just won't do to say, well, we should move on, because you really need to think hard about what you're trying to accomplish in circumstances like this. Let me point out that I don't agree with the proposition that academics somehow are these woolly-headed people and they're focusing on armed interventions. They read the same documents that officials who've embraced R2P read. We're well aware, those of us who are competent, that R2P is a spectrum that looks at atrocities, tries first to prevent it through early warning and mediation, tries to help the country develop the capacity to deal with it, and in extremist, as a last resort, it uses force. So nobody's under the illusion that R2P means simply sending the cavalry in to every country where there's an atrocity. My problem with it is this. As a norm, and it, by the way, has no standing as law, in positive law, perhaps in natural law, but not in positive law. How do you take a concept in a world of the weak and the powerful, the rich and the poor, a world that is culturally diverse, a world that pits former colonizers against those who have the memory of colonialism, and come to terms with an idea that is, in the ultimate analysis, challenging sovereignty, because that is the only protection that we countries have. There's another problem. How many of you here think that if there was a confrontation between the Israeli authorities on the West Bank tomorrow, in which many people were killed, that there would be an R2P resolution that the United States would not immediately veto in the Security Council? How many of you think if there was an R2P resolution in Myanmar, right, which is a brutal regime, that the Chinese would not veto it? How many of you think that Modi's government in Kashmir, which on a daily basis presides over the brutalization of Muslims, if we were to unleash the Indian army in Kashmir, that'd be a serious talk about any kind of R2P, the benign version, let alone military intervention? The answer is, I don't think you think so. How many of you think that a country that has a friend that is a great power will ever be subjected to anything like R2P? I don't think very many. Who does that leave? Countries that commit atrocities, but are isolated and friendless. So Gaddafi was a very good example. He was a dictator. He was a buffoon. He made himself unpopular in sub-Saharan Africa, to say nothing of the Gulf states. And so when the uprising started, it started, by the way, in December of 2010, when a fruit vendor who had been abused serially by the Tunisian police set fire to himself and set off a blaze called the Arab Spring, which went from Tunisia all the way to Syria. Talk about early warning. We are not in a position to predict the outcomes of these things. So an uprising occurred in Libya. The storyline is this. There was brutal Gaddafi who trained heavy weapons deliberately against protesters, on and on and on. That did not happen. Susan Rice, the American ambassador to the UN at the time, said Gaddafi had distributed Viagra to his soldiers so that he could rape women. That has never been established as a matter of evidence. Gaddafi's troops no doubt committed atrocities. I'm not here to apologize for the likes of him. But in the East, which was the seat of the Sanusid dynasty that Gaddafi overthrew in 1969, the revolution from day one was a violent revolution. This was in some sense a regime attacking civilians, but also caught in a civil war in which the international community began to get involved to stop atrocities. But in the process, commandos from the outside world were training the Libyan opposition to decide the outcome of the civil war. Before any resolution could be heard, there were immediate calls for Gaddafi to resign, even though, and we don't have to take him at his faith, but if you're interested in conflict resolution, you ought to. He said, we should discuss a ceasefire, we should discuss negotiations. Sarkozy had already decided he had to go, Hillary Clinton decided he had to go, everybody decided he had to go, and the more they decided that, the more emboldened the opposition became. One final point. Mustafa Abdul Jalil, the main opposition figure at the time, said that if there was not a fly zone put on Libya, 500,000 people would die. Now, where on earth did he come up with that figure? Dennis Ross, an American official, said that if Gaddafi got to Benghazi, which was in the hands of armed militants at the time, I would tell you, that 100,000 people would die. The Libyan opposition said in the first 2 weeks that 30,000 people had died. We know that at the end of the entire conflict, the total number of civilians and soldiers on all sides combined that the government of Libya gave was far less than 30,000. So the Libya story is a little bit more complicated than you think, my friends. There is no question that there was a dictator who was brutal, who was well known to the West for being brutal, nevertheless transacted with extensively. And there was an intervention that was supposed to stop the atrocities against civilians, but ended up changing the regime. I will submit to you one thing. There can be all kinds of R2P, mediation, capacity building, early warning, all of the stuff that everybody signs on to because it doesn't cost them anything. There will not be another Libya-like intervention again because the Russians and the Chinese will not allow it. If it has to be done, it'll have to be done the way Kosovo was done, by NATO declaring itself the posse and doing it. But then you have a problem, because if you can have coalitions go and decide they're going to take the law into their own hands, then you don't have a global norm. You have the operation of power politics with a normative costume. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you. So I have a list of questions here, but I think it would only be appropriate to let Savita and Jennifer respond, if you want to what Rajan said, or we can just move on down the list.
I mean, I don't disagree with anything Rajan said. I mean, of course, the situation is more complicated, and of course, I mean, my point about sort of focusing too much on I mean, first of all, the language of intervention, let's first sort of, also question that, like it's paternalistic and it's sort of removes any kind of idea of prevention from the table. It devoids people who actually are getting intervened, or whatever the English language, any agency. So, and he's right. I mean, Libya is a complicated story, like every situation is a complicated story. I am looking at it from the viewpoint of how the Security Council reacted and sort of what were the constraints and the information that they were working on. So, I mean, I don't disagree with him. And also sort of the fact remains that, yeah, of course we live and we work and we exist and the UN exists and the international norms operate in a structural environment which is all about power and politics and great powers. I mean, if Ukraine has not taught us that, then I don't know what would. And I agree with Rajan's last point that, yeah, I mean, Kosovo was a problem because what you're now seeing playing out and Russia has done this again and again with South Ossetia, with Crimea, and also with Donbass, claims that they are protecting their own populations. And even though their interventions in these situations are not legal, they are moralistic. So the argument can be used both ways.
Thank you. Do you want to say anything, Jennifer, or shall we move on?
I think I'd just make 2 points. Firstly, I think, given the UN Charter, which is an old document, but yet still an authoritative document, and as Savita said before, within the General Assembly where you have the whole membership, an important statement of principles. Within the UN Charter, when you think about the Libya intervention, which was an action that was authorized by the Council, the first time, I know some will say, well, technically this also happened in Bosnia, and I can talk about those cases, but the first time that the Council authorized the use of force in a state without that state's consent for civilian protection purposes, the first time. My view is that that should be a very, very rare occurrence. Why would you want to have a system in which you are using the use of force against a target state without that state's consent? And so most of the time that we see military deployments in situations of conflict or civil war or humanitarian crisis, it is not done without the consent of the state. It is done as part of a negotiated mandate with that state. So I would agree that in that sense, Libya was a very profound moment because you saw the Council do something that it very rarely does, and that is why we also had the abstentions. The one quibble I would have with what Rajan said was this notion of being subjected to R2P. I know you recognize that it is a principle with a wide scope, but I don't think that that's the appropriate language to use for all instances in which either regional officials or international officials are talking with states and civil society about how they can address atrocity crimes. I can tell you that in my work with civil society and states around the world, they were not thinking they were being subjected to responsibility to protect. What you're talking about is the selectivity of the application of that forceful imposition of the third pillar to certain states that do not have great power protectors. And I would be the first to admit that selectivity is baked into the third pillar of responsibility to protect. For better or for worse. You can think it's good, you can think it's bad. But so is the use of force in the UN Charter system generally. The use of force in the UN system, our collective security system, is designed to ensure selective security. It's designed to ensure selectivity. And R2P as part of that is unfortunately subject to the same selectivity.
Why is it, how is it designed to be selective in a positive sense? I'm not sure I follow you there. Because you need Security Council authorization, and that's always going to be partisan. Is that what you mean?
Well, because as Rajan said, because there'll be certain states that are either protected by a P5 member or are a P5 member that will never agree. I mean, one of the fascinating things to look back to in the negotiation of the summit outcome document was why that language case-by-case basis, because if you read Article 139 of the summit outcome document, which is the political statement, it talks about the international community being prepared to take collective action on a case-by-case basis. my reading of the history of that, and I've looked a lot at the diplomacy at the time, is there was a wide variety of states, both Western and non-Western, who really wanted case-by-case basis because they didn't want to have any kind of generalized principle. They wanted there to be negotiation on a case-by-case basis. And so that's why it's baked in, it's hardwired.
And that's
But it's
what you
also
mean by
hardwired
selectivity,
into our
right?
collective security system.
Sure, can I add
Yeah,
a
yeah,
couple
you can
not
respond.
necessarily in response, although I will something respond to you. Sorry. So at the time that Libya occurred, there was an intervention by the Gulf Cooperation Council into Bahrain, which is a small island, kind of abutting Saudi Arabia, where the United States has a naval fleet headquarters. And it's about 70%, 65 to 70% Shia. The Shia are disempowered by and large. A lot of their leaders are in prison. And it's a Sunni ruling dynasty. And when the fruit vendor immolated himself and set off this blaze across the Middle East, the Gulf Cooperation Council, led by the Saudis and the Emiratis, intervened to put down what was essentially a peaceful protest. Does anyone here remember a single Western country saying that this was outrageous, that peaceful protesters should be intervened against? No. Let me give you another example. In 2011, in the anti-Mubarak protests, 900 people were killed by the police, civilian protesters. About 2,000 of them were jailed. 2013, under Mubarak's successor, the army chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who, by the way, mounted a coup. That was okay because he was getting rid of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were voted in, but we don't like them, so that's fine. In 2013, about that same number, 900 people were killed in a couple of days in two places. El-Sisi's prisons are teeming with prisoners. Torture is used routinely. When is the last time you had anybody invoke any kind of humanitarian objection to this? I'm not talking about the Scandinavians because they're the good guys, right? Powers of consequence. Never happens. The problem with selectivity, you see, is this. War is selective, we know that. But if you're presenting humanitarian intervention as a norm that has been embraced by the international community, too much selectivity, and then it's not a norm, right? It's like saying there's a norm. Let's say that speeding offenses were a norm, and you were not allowed to drive over 55 miles an hour on the highway. But every second person could do so. How many people would consider that a fair norm? Yes, I understand selectivity. My argument is not you have to intervene everywhere. Now, as for the non-military part of it, if you're saying that R2P is about diplomacy, mediation, capacity building, early warning, there's nothing new in that. That's been in the toolkit of diplomacy for eons. So what is it that R2P brings to the table other than the kind of nice formulation that, well, the sovereign state should protect its people first. If it doesn't do so, tisk, tisk, then the responsibility devolves to the international community, and it'll do all these other peaceful things. And at the end, providing the state is not too powerful or backed by a powerful state, it'll intervene. These other things have been going on forever. Diplomacy, mediation, provision of aid, helping capacity building and all this, there's nothing new there. So what in the end are we talking about? The newness of it is the principle that is baked in at the end that if necessary, sovereignty will be violated by force of arms. That is what makes it controversial. If somebody said R2P is all about diplomacy and mediation, I don't think you'd have many people objecting to it who would. That's why it gets a lot of cachet among states because it doesn't require them to do anything or be subjected to anything. I agree.
Okay, on that note, we can pivot to another question, and it's related, and it is about the issue of what is new, what is not new. Now, what is new is that in 2008, special advisors on R2P and other aspects related to humanitarian imperative of the UN were instituted. There were special rapporteurs and special advisors, and that is an outcome of this norm, I understand. And you were one of those advisors for a while, Jennifer. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about and address indirectly Rajan's point about whether there's anything new here, because there was this new advisor. What role did and does that advisor play, and do you think it has any impact? And then I'll ask Savita, because her work is related to that via an NGO, and then Rajan will respond, and we can sort of have another round.
Yeah, good. I mean, this question of what is new and what is not new. So, Rajan, the things you focused on, diplomacy, mediation, you say that these are not new. Neither is the use of force, right? All of these tools have been around for a long time, right? What's new is the way that they are used, and what is discussed, and what is the purpose of those tools. So the use of force has been around for a long time too. So none of these tools are new, none of them, with the one exception of developing an early warning system that is particularly geared at identity-based competition and conflict that might generate particular types of violence between communities, right? So there is and this is where there's academic work around, what are the actual root causes of crimes against humanity and genocide? Are there particular dynamics that might be different from other kinds of violence? The question is, how are these tools actually used? And with responsibility to protect, the attempt was to think about how they could be used differently, to change the incentives facing particular actors, to think about how to protect particular victims, but also to think about trying to address some of those underlying causes. And it's absolutely true that it draws on a number of tools and approaches that have existed for a long time, but put to a slightly different purpose, right? So I'm not in disagreement, but I think we've got it slightly sideways, right? We're talking about tools versus purposes. Now, the question about the special advisor is a really interesting one, because there is a view, which I have some sympathy with, that the UN has proliferated in terms of the number of specialized mandates that it has over the years. And I like to sometimes explain to my own students or others that the UN system is a little bit like a Lego structure, right? Things continually get bolted on over the years, partly because it's the product of different kinds of interstate bargains, right? That they decide to bolt on a particular piece. And again, you're right, Rajan, that power has a lot to do with that, right? Particular groupings of powerful states lobby to have particular kinds of agendas turned into institutionalized capacities. So the role of the special advisor on responsibility to protect was really to take that General Assembly resolution of 2005, which was a general resolution, a statement of principle, and to say, what would it mean for that to cash out in terms of a more detailed policy framework that might actually build institutional capacity, that might be used by civil society, that might be used by national governments. And if you remember as well, at the time, those of you that have studied it, the General Assembly was tasked with having these follow-up conversations on responsibility to protect. So the role, when I got my sort of mandate letter, as it were, the role was really threefold. One was to continue the conceptual and operational development of R2P. What would it mean in practice for a number of different actors? And the Secretary General's reports were one piece of that, but only one piece where we developed that in consultation with all kinds of member states, but also trying to develop national capacity within governments and to work with civil society. So that was the first, really fleshing out what it meant. The other was trying to bring greater attention to atrocity prevention, to early action within the UN system itself. So again, there's infrastructure in the United Nations that could be used for a different purpose, right? Whether it be the special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council or the Human Rights Council itself, the Universal Periodic Review process, different special representatives of the Secretary General who could ask more specific questions about dynamics, usually between communities, that could, in theory, but also with some good evidence, escalate into forms of violence that one would ideally want to prevent. So that was one job of the special advisor. And I would say on that score, if I was grading, we didn't do very well. And that's partly a challenge. I'm going to use this kind of managerial term. I hated it at the time and I still hate it. Mainstreaming, right? Responsibility to protect in the UN system, really difficult. Just as any agenda that you try to take across that huge organization and make a part of everything the organization does. So that was the second part. And then lastly, the special advisor's role was really to try to take responsibility to protect beyond the UN, out of New York, that it wasn't just a conversation yearly when people would come to the General Assembly, state representatives give their 2-minute speech, kind of looks performative, what exactly is going on outside the UN in different states and societies around the globe. And we worked on that, again, in partnership with civil society, but also with the National Focal Points Network. So governments around the world who appointed either atrocity prevention or responsibility to protect focal points. And we worked through them and with them. These roles, as I say, have proliferated in the UN system over the years. And I think there's a live debate as to whether that has fragmented what the UN does. The argument in favor is to say that in discussions at the highest level within the UN system, when you're talking about different country situations, that you do need people at the table who are asking certain questions. And so I'll give you an example that I don't think breaches any confidence around Myanmar and its elections in 2015. I hope I've got my chronology correct. In my role, I was part of a meeting in which we were talking about the elections, and different officials from the UN were saying, this is great, this has been a peaceful election. And myself and one other UN official from the Human Rights Mandate said, yes, but have we had any discussion here around the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are disenfranchised? This didn't come up in the conversation until we began to ask questions about that particular identity group. And so that was the role of the special advisor, was to be that voice at the table asking those sorts of questions.
So if I could just, for a few minutes or a few seconds, ask you to, there's a lot of students here taking a class on this topic or related topics. What, in a daily basis, does the special advisor do? Is it a full-time job? Or you were also an academic at the time, but were you on helicopters to conflict zones throughout the world, or whoever it is now, or are these consultations taking place mainly here or in the conflict zones themselves, or the potential conflict zones?
So it was a real mix. It's hard to give a ordinary day, but I would say 4 types of activities, right? So this special advisor on responsibility to protect works in the Office on the Responsibility to Protect and Genocide Prevention, and there is a special advisor on the prevention of genocide. That is a full-time Undersecretary General in the UN system. It's a very senior position. The Responsibility to Protect special advisor is one of these many $1-a-year contracts. So it's not full-time. I had another job at the same time as I had this job, but I was supported by the Joint Office. And so some of my work was in New York, working with state representatives and the group of friends. Also, I'd put in that bucket in Geneva with the Human Rights Council. So that was, if I could cut a day into a pie chart. So let's say maybe 25, 30%. Another portion of that was visiting regional organizations around the world whose peace and security architecture or human rights architecture would have more particular countries that were of importance. And so I visited many different regional organizations around the world. And then a portion of my day was working with civil society, both in New York when it was relevant, but also every time I went on a mission, local civil society, and then lastly, country visits. I did the last less. There was a little bit of a division of labor with the Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide. So sometimes he would play that role in the field rather than I. He did his main missions at the time in the years that I was there included CAR, South Sudan, Burundi, also Iraq, Yemen. I would say I very much agree with Rajan's points about the selectivity and the problems with the selectivity. It was our office that was one of the first voices to raise concerns about humanitarian abuse and the abuse of humanitarian principles over the war in Yemen. Nobody was talking about it, but we published an op-ed and began to talk about it. Also, I'd like to say, because I know we're coming to this, even though states are, because they're inherently political, selective, we in the Joint Office saw it as our job to be as consistent as we possibly could. So in 2014, we issued a statement on the situation in Israel and Palestine, which, as you will note, is not something that states collectively have done, but we did.
Okay, we'll come back to that case, no doubt. But first, maybe Savita, you can tell us a bit how your work at the Global Center fits into this ecosystem that is obviously developed in the last 15 years or so.
So, I mean, we work very closely with every special advisor. I mean, Global Center is very much in New York, Geneva, NGO which sits in the multilateral space. So our sort of work was very much supporting the mandate of the special advisor by, I mean, providing country analysis and sort of also, we are the civil society actors. So we also Jennifer and the Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide would release a statement, but it's also civil society organizations which advocate and lobby them to release a particular statement. We will call the office and say, you should be saying something on Myanmar, you should be saying something about Israel, Palestine, you should be saying something about Ethiopia or whatever crisis is happening at that moment. But I mean, I agree with all the points that Jennifer brought up, that the role of the special advisor is to bring the lens in any conversation, and that's what she did. I mean, in a conversation on Myanmar, or even in the conversation on Syria, how are we dealing with minorities? And what's new about R2P is also sort of bringing in a lens of atrocity prevention. So R2P is this political norm, but what rose out of that is this entire sort of field about atrocity prevention, which looks at the world from a perspective of whether there is a risk or possibility of the 4 crimes. So genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So we don't look at the world from a human rights perspective. The way we will look at it is, because R2P is the mandate, is that whether there is a possibility of these crimes and who can stop it, who can do what. So again, it's not selective. We look at every country in the world. And then we will go and lobby member states. We lobby the UN Secretariat to be able to speak, because even the UN, many a times there are so many, it's not easy for even your office to speak out on a lot of crises, because there's so much pressure from different parts of the UN, different member states who will pressure the UN not to say anything.
How does that take place, by the way, concretely? How is pressure to, be selective in a certain way work?
I mean,
the note slipped under the door, people.
No, we will. I mean, so
tip water on you in the cafeteria or something. No.
So it's a recent example of sort of Myanmar is a case. Myanmar is a case where we have not seen much action at the multilateral level. The UN Security Council has been completely ineffective in this. I mean, partly because of China, but partly because also the other members have lacked courage to even propose a good resolution which actually is effective. I mean, they have a resolution now, but it's really just calling on the Myanmar government to cease and stop. But the way we sort of work is that when we start looking at a particular country, let's say Venezuela, we will start working with civil society organizations, human rights defenders from Venezuela. So slowly the person who leads that work will start creating these networks. We will tap into these networks, understand what is it that the civil society organizations there want, what are the mechanisms that will work for them. So for Venezuela, it was very much about working with organizations that were collecting evidence, that were, working with people who have been arbitrarily detained. And sort of the one recommendation that emerged was that we should have a monitoring body on Venezuela. And in the Human Rights Council, where you have, which is, which has a mandate to create different commissions of inquiry on a particular situations. Now, the role of a commission of inquiry is to establish the fact of the situation. What has happened? So it's a group of people who are independent, who will look at a particular situation and say, this is what is happening. This is who is being targeted. This is who's committing crimes. What are sort of the root causes around it, which are leading to it? What should the UN do? What should the member states do? And because they're independent, they're able to sort of speak in a more direct way, in a more stronger way than even the Secretary General can do. So we will work with these. So we worked with Venezuelan civil society. We were sort of the multilateral organization which was opening the black box of the UN. Then we'll go and meet different countries which are on the council at that moment who can vote to create this mechanism. We will convince them based on different, this is the reason why you should do it. This is the reason why a commission of inquiry is necessary, because if there's a scrutiny on a situation, the government will, not stop, but they will not be as blatantly violating human rights principles or committing atrocities against their citizens. So, after a lot of advocacy, you meet every member in the HRC. You also sort of, deploy every leverage. So if there is you deploy the US, you say, put pressure from, you should not be leading, but put pressure on your allies. So you just leverage every situation, and a lot of it is led by from people on the ground. And then we had it was not called Commission of Inquiry because everything is political within the UN. So it was called a fact-finding mission. And the fact-finding mission has been very useful in Venezuela because it is not only talked about like what is happening, but what needs to happen. Like, what is it that they need? They actually need reform in the justice sector because, so those sort of provide a roadmap, provide some reassurance to the community that is suffering that people are watching. There are limits to international action. In the end, real change comes organically from within societies. Sometimes those are big fails, like Arab Spring was a very particular moment, and then it sort of, it went wrong in many places. It was not supported by the powers that be and all of that. But organic change comes from within. International community's role is, in many cases right now, is to monitor, to provide information, to establish the fact of the situation.
Thank you, terrific. Rajan, you spent a lot of time in Ukraine lately, because it's your original area of expertise, and you should all follow Professor Menon on Twitter, and you can see his updates.
Stay off of Twitter. I only got on it because my job required it. Yeah. Big time sink.
But it's more useful for your work than the other social media platforms that people tend to be on. But there are links also to his opinion pieces in newspapers and magazines, which are about the situation in Ukraine, in which we are dealing with not only a military situation, but also one in which atrocity crimes are taking place, indisputably. Some are talking about genocide, but more it's war crimes, possible crimes against humanity, and also the crime of aggression, which is a separate crime. Do you see any intersection between the kind of issues and processes that Jennifer and Savita are talking about with the Ukraine situation that you're seeing? Because you're there on the ground often.
Right. I wouldn't recommend traveling there, by the way. The hotel rates are really affordable now because there's nobody staying in the hotels. Dirk, just before this, a couple of points on this. I'm still confused because if you look at data collection on what is going on in countries that could eventually trigger some sort of atrocity, information gathering, mediation, track 2 dialogues. For those of you who don't know, these are non-officials who talk to one another. A lot of this stuff has been going on. So I don't know. I'm still confused as to what in the end is new here. By the way, I'm not casting any aspersions on the special advisor on R2P. I'm glad Jennifer did it, and before her, Ed Luck did it. These are good people of goodwill who are respected academics, and I have nothing but praise for the work that they do. The problem with opening a discussion with a highly repressive government that rigs elections or doesn't allow them is they'll discuss things with you. They'll say, oh, you're just wrong. We have really free elections here. And you say, we have 30,000 prisoners? No, no, no. We have only 5,000. Of those 5,000, 4,999 are terrorists. These regimes exist and survive because they are engaged in repression for a reason. If they stopped being repressive, they would collapse. And no government that I know of is in the business of suicide. Governments like to stay in place. So I'm all for going and talking to civil society groups. By the way, in some of these countries, civil society groups are skating on really thin ice, right? If you go to Belarus, for example, and talk to civil society groups, most of them either are in jail or they're exiled. So I'm all for conversation, but at the end of the day, call me callous. I don't think it really matters very, very much. Discussions and documentation and reports and so on. I do believe that at some point, citizens believe they've had enough and they take matters into their own hands and things occur organically. We ought not to have the conceit to think that we can somehow sort of massage and medicate and shape what happens in countries. I'm not in favor of that. Now, on Ukraine, Dirk, it's a different animal because this is really an interstate war, right? War is not new, by the way. Jennifer's quite right. War is not new, but it's not being presented as a norm. Nobody says war is a norm, but everyone says R2P is a norm. It may surprise you to know, because you may think I'm a terribly callous person, unlike my two colleagues, that I actually am in support of arming Ukraine. I think the Russian intervention was unprovoked. NATO expansion was a terrible idea. I was opposed to it from the very time it was just a concept. But on February 23rd, 2022, the idea that Putin faced, as my good friend John Mearsheimer says, an existential threat is ludicrous. It faced no such thing. And I have seen ruined cities, refugees, orphans, hospitals that have been bombed. The bill for rebuilding Ukraine is estimated by its prime minister to be about $750 billion. That it's not only a heavy lift for those who are helping Ukraine. Many poor countries saddled with debt, climate change problems, poverty problems will have less money because of what has happened here. But so R2P doesn't apply in this case. What will change the war in Ukraine is that if Putin believes it is not winnable, he will look for a way out. But I don't expect that to happen. Why? Because there are 4 provinces, only 3 of which only one of which he fully controls, that he staged a referendum in, which is illegal, by the way. You can't enter a country, conquer land, and stage a referendum and then annex it. But he's annexed it to the Russian Federation. And he said, these territories, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson and Zaporizhia in the south, Donetsk and Lugansk in the east, are forever part of the Russian Federation. Xi Jinping was just recently in Moscow. And the day before he arrived, Putin said, oh, we're all for negotiations. We are reasonable people. But one thing, we'll never give up these provinces. So what is there to negotiate? It's like a guy who comes into your house, steals everything, and says, oh, I'm willing to negotiate. I just won't give you back any of your property. I mean, would you be negotiating with somebody like that? So I think that this is a war that's going to drag on for a very, very long time. I don't think the Ukrainians will be able to evict Russian forces from all of their territory. But I think Putin is in there for the long haul, and no amount of resolution passing will do any good. As far as the War Crimes Tribunal is concerned, there's no question that the Russians have committed mass atrocities. Absolutely no doubt. Do I expect Putin to be in the dock? I don't think so. Do I expect Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, to be in the dock? I don't think so. Do I expect Nikolai Patrushev, the Secretary General of the Security Council of Russia, to be in the dock? I don't think so. So R2P, I know, is not meant to resolve these problems, so we can't saddle R2P with this. It's not the fault of R2P. But I am, on balance, very pessimistic. If you talk to people in Ukraine about how long the war will last, they will say to you that you have to understand two things. One is that if we lose this war, we lose our country. No Russian soldier believes that if Russia loses the war, they lose their country. The second thing they will tell you is this is not going to end anytime soon. It could drag on. Putin's calculation, and I admire him for thinking this way, is that over time, the law of numbers will prevail. He will simply deploy more soldiers and more tanks and more artillery. And ultimately, the West's will begin to fray. NATO will become divided, and he will somehow pull off something that he can take home as a victory. Why must he do that? Because this is his war. His survival, politically, perhaps even physically, depends on it. So I bring you no news, good news on the Ukraine front. Every day in every city that I was there was an air raid. It's a really dangerous situation. Just today, there was a rocket attack and a drone attack in which a dormitory was blown up and a monastery was blown up. There are people I know who tell me that the Russians don't attack civilian structures. This is just not true because I've seen them with my own eyes. Sorry, it's a ramble, but
No,
I can't give you any good news.
Okay.
I have to take the strongest objection to this. We're in a program where we're discussing atrocities and war crimes, and the United States is risking nuclear war over Ukraine, which is a proxy war between two reactionary imperialist powers. Yes, Putin's a mass murderer, and this country has committed more atrocities than any country on the face of the earth. And we are being threatened with nuclear war, and the future of humanity is being threatened by the system, not for human rights, not for the right to pursue.
Sir,
Can you give me 1 minute?
Jim, could you wrap it up because we're getting a bit off topic.
I appreciate it.
No, it's
Okay.
fine.
It's a war for global imperialist domination, which is how these people always operate, whatever the political issues. This is a time when the people in this country have the responsibility to take to the streets and oppose this war with all our hearts and souls. We will be discussing this at Revolution Books right over on Malcolm X Avenue. And I'm going to close with the words of the revolutionary leader, Bob Avakian. We can no longer allow these imperialists to control the fate of the earth. And all the examples you gave previously, you showed how these imperialist powers use these doctrines.
I think
to
Raj
suit
can
their
respond
own
now, I
interests.
think.
So I invite people, I'll stop, I invite people to get a leaflet that I have and talk to me further.
Thank you for using our meeting to proselytize for your
I have to
cause.
just say two
Okay,
sentences to him.
And on live stream, but Raj
Sir,
can
it
respond.
is your right as an American citizen to demonstrate against the war. More power to you. Those of you who want to join him. I have no problem with that. On nuclear war, can you point to me a document in which President Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons against the United States or any NATO country? What is the day in which he said that?
First of all, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, who are much more expert in this than I, have moved the clock to a minute, a half a minute before midnight, because neither Russia nor the United States has renounced first use of nuclear weapons. Putin has threatened verbally, I didn't see a document, but threatened verbally.
When did he threaten to attack the United States?
No, to use nuclear weapons. And the point, if I just might, and I appreciate us having the argument here, that's the grave danger. If Russia begins to lose, what happens if they use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine? The United States is going to feel compelled to escalate. and then things are completely out of control and we don't know where it's going to go. I'm not sitting here predicting and saying there's going to be a nuclear war, but even that there's a danger, even that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is warning of this danger, shows how outrageous this escalation by both Russia and especially the United States. They're basically directly fighting Russia with the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder.
Okay, I think we've got
humanity.
we've got
So
that.
in order to put your soul at rest, you would like Ukraine to succumb to partition. Am I reading you correctly?
No, I would like a revolution that overthrows capitalism and imperialism and ends these endless wars. That's
Okay.
what I would like.
We've had a good little chat about this. I think everybody got the various points, but we need to pivot to some other questions, if you don't mind. But Jennifer,
Can I just say, I mean, I really welcome your interventions on Ukraine, and it's really good to hear from someone who has seen these attacks on cities firsthand. And, you know, I completely share your pessimism in one way, that these processes that try to document will actually lead to high-level figures being held accountable in, you know, the most powerful way. My view on this is, I do think responsibility to protect is relevant in the following sense. It's relevant along with other bodies of law and norms that seek to call out war crimes. And really, the data collection and the raising of concerns, the attempt to say, you know, attacks on civilian infrastructure are not a normal part of war, right? This is a conscious choice to do this, right? This is not, we're normalizing it by letting it go on without calling it what it is. And in a sense, what's going on, it's not for us on the outside. It's not because we necessarily believe people will be behind bars tomorrow, but those who have experienced these crimes, their families, they need those outside to call these things what they are, right? War and the use of force is, unfortunately, part of the human condition. But engaging in war crimes of this kind is a very conscious choice on behalf of belligerents. And I do think R2P, along with other agendas, needs to call it out, even if we don't think it will lead to people being in the dock tomorrow. And I would only just say justice is long. We don't know.
You know, I'm in agreement with you, but let me just say this. When it comes to the documentation.
Raj on the mic.
When it comes to the documentation of.
Your poor back.
That's all right. When it comes to, it's his fault. I'm only kidding. When it comes to the documentation of atrocity crimes, 90% of the evidence that the world will rely on will be provided by NGOs in Ukraine who are working diligently as the Ukrainian government. So R2P and outsiders can help much, but I think in the grand scheme of things, the Ukrainians are doing a very, very good job. Just to come back to you, sir, for a moment, I won't.
But Savita,
I won't engage. Yeah, I won't engage him. There is no question that there are certain risks involved in this war. When people say stop the war, what does it mean? It has certain consequences for another country that was attacked unprovoked. It doesn't matter that the United States has behaved very badly in many parts of the world. You're absolutely right. No quarrel with you about that. But look at it from the standpoint of a Ukrainian, right? Putin says, I want to end the war. I'm going to grab 4 of your territories and keep them. You're essentially asking Ukraine to fall on its sword. And I don't think if you believe in the sovereign territorial integrity of countries, which the Russians themselves recognized in the Budapest Memorandum, that you can rightfully ask them to do that.
Okay, Savita, do you want to chime in here?
No, just to build upon Jennifer's point that, Ukrainian NGOs are doing a great job in collecting information, but a lot of the support and how to collect information, how to document it is being provided by external actors. So there are different roles that we all play in this. And also, with Ukraine, what we're actually seeing is over-documentation at some levels. And whereas in other crises, like from Yemen to Myanmar to Ethiopia, we don't see that much evidence collection. And evidence collection itself is a process which requires a lot of training. So there are a lot of organizations, the UN, that are helping the Ukrainian NGOs in being able to do this. And I think that the ICC indictment of Vladimir Putin, I mean, it is a bit of a stunt. No, I mean, I don't think that they're going to bring him to Hague. But the fact is that it does send a message to the people of Ukraine that the world is watching, that the deportation of their children and then their subsequent adoption or absorption within the Russian nation is not something which is being unnoticed. So I think there's a huge part about justice which is important, and R2P in the context of sort of just looking at the situation from a perspective of who is committing war crimes, who is committing crimes against humanity, how are those being committed, that is an important indicator, because then as that sort of also leads to understanding what is needed for the healing of society, what kind of psychosocial support we provide as we go along. Because it's not as if Ukraine is alone in that fight.
But
I mean, and I would want to see something similar happen in Ethiopia, where again, I mean, the way the crimes are committed, who the crimes are committed against, understanding that is important, because then how you sort of provide help, either through the national mechanisms, international mechanisms, is then informed by that.
Savita, the overwhelming majority of the funding to organizations, and I know these organizations who are looking into these atrocities, come from money they raise internally or from other NGOs or wealthy benefactors. The UN may be giving money,
No, absolutely. But the NGOs and the CSOs, I mean, I know of multiple organizations who, through third-party foundations, are providing this support, who are providing training, because collection of evidence is not something.
Right, but what does that have to do with R2P? I'm confused.
No. I mean, see, the thing is, it's not about just sort of, it's collecting evidence around war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Right, but I'm saying that R2P is not really relevant to
Yeah, I think we kind of moved on to
atrocity
atrocity crimes more
R2P
generally.
in a way that is just about this international commitment which people are failing to uphold. Or I'm talking about sort of how do we address the prevention and reaction to atrocity crimes.
No.
And that has very much been informed by the adoption of R2P, and that has led to a proliferation and creation of different mechanisms that are around.
I've never heard the word R2P ever used by a Ukrainian NGO.
No, but they're not supposed to be using that. That's not.
But they're not even funded. I mean,
no, but I think that the problem here is that you are looking at R2P in a way which is about sort of, okay, there was no action there. It's selective.
No.
It's in the context of sort of a norm which guides the action of the United Nations system. I am looking at R2P as a way that informs prevention and response to these crimes, not only by the United Nations system, but by a host of different actors. That includes civil society actors, that includes the UN Secretariat, that includes different kinds of member states, and it is also bilateral as well as multilateral action.
My point,
so on Myanmar,
my point is that the atrocity crimes that you and I agree are bad things, all of us, I think, right? The documentation of that is going on in Ukraine largely through funding that has not that much to do with the United Nations.
So, but I'm not talking about just the United Nations. That's the difference in the way.
So how? But how does R2P fit in? I mean, tell me what is R2P doing in Ukraine?
It's not owned by the United Nations.
It's not owned by the United Nations. I mean, that's what I'm trying to tell you. Like, people in Myanmar, when they're marching around and they're saying we need R2P, the things that they're calling for is not a military intervention or UN Security Council resolution. What they're calling for is a sanctions regime, which is maybe the US imposing sanctions, the EU imposing sanctions on the oil and gas industry in Myanmar, or calling on Singapore to stop supplying the aviation fuel. So it's
now you've broadened the definition of R2P so
no,
much.
I'm not broadening the definition. I'm talking about prevention and response to atrocity crimes. You are just looking at R2P as as a UN Security Council norm. Yeah. But as Jennifer said, that one of her roles was to also take it away. So like when I talk to a state, I'll say it's not only your responsibility to protect in the context of the multilateral system, it's the United States' responsibility to protect citizens in Myanmar. How can you do this? You can do this by imposing US sanctions or US Treasury sanctions on these individuals.
But if I understand you correctly, you're saying that if NGOs in Ukraine are documenting atrocities and Ukrainian officials and NGOs are calling for sanctions and punishment, That somehow is an illustration of R2P in action?
Absolutely. I think that that's absolutely, because it's about sort of creating this before 2005. And I think that even through the 90s, there was not that understanding about, I mean, we talked about human rights violations, we talked about development, we talked about conflict prevention. In response to your question about what is new about R2P is that it has led to sort of understanding that war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide are not exceptional activities. They're happening all the time. We are seeing patterns of it emerging from, I mean, name the country. And I mean, in India, we see patterns of emerging, which are around sort of, risks around atrocity
But now
crimes.
you've made the tent of R2P so big that anything that goes on
Yeah, but
all
the
these fronts is
toolbox is wide. No, the toolbox is not. I mean, I'm not understanding your toolbox, because my toolbox includes not only mediation, good offices. It's about sanctions, arms embargo, helping national. Because that's primary responsibility of the state is the first part of R2P. Second part of R2P is to provide assistance and capacity building. What is assistance and capacity building? Assistance and capacity building is item 10 resolution. How can you improve your national human rights organizations? How can you use the special rapporteur on minority rights in a way that can then encourage your government to adopt legislation which is about minority protection? Because that is what atrocity
So
crimes are
R2P
all
should get
about.
credit for all of these things.
No, it's
No, it's not
R2P
about
getting
credit. It's not about credit.
It's not about
It's
credit.
about-
I'm not understanding the credit. It's not about credit or discredit. It's a new way of looking at how populations suffer and what kind of response is needed.
What's the new way?
The new way is looking at not only in the context of that human rights violations are something which are happening to individuals. You can look at it in terms of patterns. That when a certain identity group is being targeted, for example, the Rohingya, the targeting of Rohingya started not with only the expulsion from Bangladesh in 2017. It started with different laws that were about sort of excluding them from political process, imposing laws around, registering births, not allowing them to register marriages. And that's what you see. You see a beginning of a pattern in which you're seeing that there's a possible acts of genocide would be committed against
So
them.
this improves on the Genocide Convention, the Torture Convention, the Refugee
absolutely.
Convention.
So
In what ways?
because it provides an impetus for action.
So do those other pieces of legislation.
But you have not seen that kind of action coming out of those. Whereas with the language around atrocity prevention,
Seriously, I mean, you think all these things, data collection and war crime documentation,
no,
Ukraine
not
wouldn't
at
happen
all.
but for
Not at all. And I'm not even asking them to call it R2P. That's not what I'm asking them to call it. When I'm explaining R2P to states, I say that there's a gamut of action which is part of this.
Yeah, but we
It's
have to
not
have
just
some-
about the UN Security Council.
We have to have some conceptual clarity about
The
exactly
conceptual
what this thing
clarity
is.
is the crimes.
It's the focus on the crimes.
Yeah, it's
and
the focus on the crimes.
It's the focus
It's not
on the
about
crimes and,
the
yeah.
actor, It's
Jennifer?
not about him.
yeah, it's the, I
'Cause we're finishing in 1 minute.
I
so-
do understand your worry, right? About kind of an elastic conception of the agenda. But I think, if we can bring us back, the principle is designed to give attention to 4 acts, right? And the reality is that there, just as one might say with respect to something like human rights, there are a variety of tools and approaches that at the end of the day may be effective in protecting populations or protecting populations from these crimes, but hopefully better than that, preventing these dynamics from escalating. So, it would be great if we could say R2P should be really narrow because there's like 2 things you need to do to prevent atrocity crimes. There isn't 2 things. The fact of the matter is it's narrow in that it's focused on atrocity crimes, but the agenda is broad. And so just because it expands doesn't mean that it's suddenly becoming incoherent.
Dirk is getting impatient, so I'm not gonna.
Well, we have a
response.
live stream and students need to go to their next class, and we've hit 5 o'clock. And with that, before everyone makes a lot of noise and leaves, I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for this very enlightening conversation. And thank you all for attending. And those of you who are writing a paper on this due on Friday, you have lots of material now, lots of material to write about. See you then. Thank you.
Yes, it's all right. It's okay. I heard Dirk told us, but I wish